Hi there. This is Stacy James with Just Spoolin' Around, and I want to begin first by saying thank you so much for supporting my tiny business. I absolutely love knitting and crocheting and have been doing this for just over 4 decades. I discovered this chunky yarn a couple years ago, which gave me the opportunity to start my business and share beautiful, custom, handmade knits at much more reasonable prices than with the standard smaller weight yarns. I'm so excited to provide you with this thorough tutorial on all the techniques and methods required for successfully hand knitting your very own blanket. So let's get started. The materials and supplies we'll be working with include 5 balls of yarn, a scissors, any color upholstery thread. I like to use neutral colors like gray, cream, and beige, and a lighter. We'll also be using a product called Fray Check, which I will introduce later in the tutorial. Okay, so we just need 1 ball of yarn, and we're going to begin by unraveling our first ball of yarn. This makes working with the yarn much easier. The first thing we're going to do is make a foundation chain consisting of 22 interlocking loops. This is the number of loops needed for a blanket width of 35 inches. To begin, we're going to hold the tail end of the yarn in our left hand at least 4 inches from the end while holding the active yarn in our right hand. To make the first loop, bring the yarn in your right hand towards you and lay it over the top of the tail end. Your active yarn is now above and your first loop has been made. The size of the chain loops is very important. They need to be long enough to cover the width of each stitch you'll be making in the first row. To keep your loops consistent and uniform, you will use your fingers as a gauge. Each loop in your foundation chain should be at least 3 fingers length, not tight, but snug. To make your second loop, push the active yarn through the back of the first loop, otherwise known as the active loop, with the active yarn feeding through so that it's closest to you, or through the bottom of the first loop. You will continue to push the active yarn through the active loop until you have 22 loops. If your active yarn is feeding through the top of your loop, the chain will twist. So it's very important to make sure that active yarn is feeding through the bottom of the loop. It helps to keep your loops lying on a flat surface once they've been worked so the chain doesn't become twisted. So we're going to pull that loop through the back of the active loop, now closing it. Again, pushing it through the back, and we've got it 3 fingers length. Pull up another loop through the back of that loop. And again, we're pulling it up through the back of that loop and making it 3 fingers length. Pull through the back, 3 fingers length. Now I'm going to show you from the back side what we're doing. And you're going to push that through, draw up your loop, and make it 3 finger lengths. Again, from the back, you can see the yarn going through the back to the front of that active loop. And now let's count our chains from the bottom legs. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. So there's 14. Pushing it through the back, we have 15. Again, pushing that in through the back, drawing up that loop, we have 16. There's 17. We have 18, 19. Push that in through the back. Draw up the loop, 3 fingers width. 19. 20. 21. Oh, maybe 22. Let's count again. One last time, just to make sure. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, and 22. We need to adjust this last chain by making it a bit smaller than the rest because it actually becomes the first stitch of the first row. So you're just going to pull the active yarn until the loop fits tightly around just 2 fingers. Next, we're going to turn our foundation chain upside down. Be sure to turn the entire chain upside down, lying on a flat surface. We are going to be working through these humps here. This is that first one. And you can see them running down the middle of your chain. The very first hump is connected to that last chain we just made smaller for the first row, first stitch of the first row. And we will be drawing up a loop through the back of that hump to create the second loop in the first row. Remember, second loop. Our first loop is the one we made smaller. This loop will only be 1 finger length. So we make these really small. I'm just making an adjustment there on that first stitch. And there's the second stitch in the first row, 1 finger length. Okay, now let's find our second hump right here. You can see it here. Because our chains are so long, we need to cinch the hump up against the active yarn as close to that second loop that we just made, and push that yarn through the back of the hump, drawing up a loop just 1 finger length. Now we'll find the next hump right there. We're going to cinch it up against that previous hump, draw up a loop through the back of the hump, 1 finger length. Let's find the next hump. Draw that loop through, 1 finger length. Here's the next one. Cinch it up real close. There it is. I'm going to cinch that up. Push that yarn through the back of the hump. Here I'm just adjusting. Sometimes it pulls that previous loop a little tighter, so you have to adjust sometimes. And we'll get that next hump. Cinch it in, draw up the loop through the back, 1 finger length. Find your next hump. Cinch those 2 humps together. Draw a loop through the back of that hump, 1 finger length. Here's the next hump. Cinch that up together. Draw that loop through the back of the hump. As you can see here, our work stitches are starting to curl. That's normal. You want it to do that. As the foundation chain is beginning to curl where we've worked our loops, this is what we want to happen. This curling effect means you're minimizing the length of yarn between each stitch, something we refer to as slack. So minimizing slack throughout your entire project is very important because as you work the blanket, the stitches will settle, causing the blanket to stretch. The more slack between the stitches, the more your blanket will stretch, resulting in bigger holes than you may like. This is especially true with the first and last rows of the project, which is why we're making these loops on the first row so small. We will repeat this method on the last row as well. The foundation chain, along with the first row, takes the longest to master, so be kind to yourself. If your foundation chain loops are too small, they will not cover the width of your stitches as you continue to work. When this happens, your work becomes wider than your foundation chain, so it's always better to have your foundation chain loops too big than too small. When in doubt, make those foundation chain loops uncomfortably large. If you need to rip it out and start over numerous times, that is normal. When I began working with this chunky stuff, I can't even tell you how many times I ripped out my work to start over again, and I've been crocheting and knitting for decades. There is a skill to using your hands as your tools, and it takes practice to master consistency and tension throughout your project. Now, once you make it past the foundation chain and the first row, it's smooth sailing from there, I promise. Okay? So we're still working our humps here, making them 1 finger length. Find the next one, cinch that up, draw the loop up through the back of that hump, 1 finger length. Find that next hump, draw the loop through the back of the hump after cinching it close to the previous hump, drop that loop 1 finger length, and then continue curling your chain as you go. We're going to keep this curling as we go, okay? There's the next hump. Cinch it in, draw a loop through the back of that hump, 1 finger length. And now here is the last one. Sometimes it's hard to differentiate the hump on this last chain. So if you turn the chain right side up, you can place your finger under those top 2 legs of the chain, revealing a V. You can see that each chain is a series of V's that resemble a beautiful braid. The method of working your first row loops or knit stitches gives your foundation chain a much more polished look. That strand under the V on the underside of the chain is your hump. Okay, so we'll work that last hump and get ready to start row 2. And draw that loop through the back of the hump and make it 1 finger in length. Okay, before working row 2, let's take this time to count your loops beginning with the last stitch you worked. Remember, the very last loop from your chain counts as your first stitch of the first row and the last stitch of the second row once you work that chain. So please be sure to include that in your count. You should have 22 stitches or loops, and if you don't, rip it out and try it again if you can't find the hump you've missed. If you feel as though you want to rip out your hair, please call me first, okay? We want all hairs intact. Okay, continuing on to row 2. The only difference in how you're going to work the rest of your stitches before binding off is that you will use 2 fingers to gauge the size of your loops, as so. Okay, so we've just made the first stitch on row 2. So grab that next stitch, draw it in close to the stitch you just made, and then drop the loop through the back of that active stitch and use your 2 fingers as a gauge for size. And here's that next hump or loop, sorry. Got the next stitch, and we're going to draw up a loop through the back as close as we can to that previous stitch, 2 fingers in length. We've got our next stitch. Draw it in close. Draw the loop through the back of that stitch, 2 fingers in length. You can unroll your foundation chain as you go along. Here we've got our next stitch. I'm going to draw that in close. Draw the loop up through the back in 2 finger widths. Okay, we're going to do it again. We have that next stitch. Bring it in close. Draw the loop through the back. I'm going to do it again with the next stitch, and so on and so forth. I'll continue through until you're comfortable. Grab that next stitch, draw it in close, draw a loop through the back of that stitch. Use your 2 fingers to gauge size. Grab the next stitch, bring it in close, draw up the loop, use your 2 fingers as a guide. All right, let's get the next stitch here. We're going to draw it in close, drop a loop through the back of that stitch, use our 2 fingers as a guide. We've got the next stitch, draw it in close, drop a loop through the back, and use 2 fingers as a guide. Go to our next stitch, draw it in close, drop a loop through the back of that stitch, and use your 2 fingers as a guide. We're going to continue to repeat this. I know I sound like a broken record, but the repetition helps. We've got our next stitch here. We're going to push that yarn through the back loop and use our 2 fingers as a guide. Here's our next stitch. Draw it in close. Let's see it from the back here. Draw that yarn through the back and use 2 fingers as a guide for your loop. And we've got some lovely birds chirping in the background. Okay, here we go. We've got another stitch that we're making using our 2 fingers. Grab our next stitch, drop the loop, and use our 2 fingers. We're getting close to that last stitch. Well, we're going to do something just a little bit different, and it's only going to be when we're working this second row, okay? Because we're going to be coming up on that last chain that we made in the foundation chain, which, if you remember, counts as the first stitch on the first row. So here we're working that first hump we made, okay, but that's actually the second stitch in row 1, and here is our first stitch. And what we want to do is turn that stitch to get it positioned the same way each preceding chain is positioned, because when we worked that second stitch of row 1 through the back of the first hump, it changed the positioning of the top and bottom legs on this stitch we're now turning. This is another tip to make your blanket more polished, okay? So here we see the back of the stitch, okay? Once we turn it, we're going to draw it in close and bring up that loop. But this one we only want 1 finger width. Now we've just finished row 2. Okay, let's take a look at how our foundation chain looks. It should look like this soft, squishy braid, okay? All these chains are nice and fat and squishy. And we want to give it a little stretch and make sure that it's got malleability here. And that's a very, very good stretch. That is exactly what we want to see, okay? This is a good time to measure your width and make sure you're on track. If your chain is measuring between 33 and 35 inches, you're good. Typically, if your width is outside these parameters, your blanket isn't going to work up to the size you wanted. Continue on if size is not important, but if it is, you'll want to rip it all out and start over with the foundation chain. If your blanket width is less than 33 inches, your foundation chains are too small, so you want to make them larger. Contrarily, if your width is greater than 35 inches, your chains are too big, so you'll want to make them smaller. Now let's count our stitches to make sure we still have 22. So there we've got 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, and 22. Now we'll continue working each row, remembering to draw a loop through the last stitch of the row just completed to make the first stitch of the new row you'll be working. So here's that stitch right here. It's our first stitch of our third row. Make those first and last stitches in each row just a tiny bit smaller to keep the sides of your blankets from overstretching. This is another tip to help make your blanket more polished. Continue knitting your rows in this fashion until you reach the end of your first ball of yarn. Then return to the tutorial and I'll show you 2 of the 3 ways we can join a new ball of yarn to the end of another. Now, as a beginner, one of these first 2 methods may be your best option until you get comfortable with the knitting process. However, I will also teach you the third, which is my preferred joining method if you'd like to tackle it all at once. I'm using 2 different colors here to make it easier to see how joining works. I'll also be introducing the use of Fray Check that was mentioned early on. We can join by burning the ends together or tying them together. To join by burning, the first thing we need to do is prepare the ends. So let's grab our scissors. Actually, let's shift gears here. I'm going to demonstrate tying first. So we'll put the scissors down and grab up our 2 ends. So here you're going to just tie the 2 ends together, but be sure not to pull from the very ends to tighten, as this yarn has a tendency to unravel. If that happens, you'll have to cut the yarn down far enough to ensure the center thread holding all the fibers together hasn't been compromised. When tightening from the end side of the knot, grab the yarn tightly just below the ends. You don't want your fingers slipping off the ends. Pulling from the active yarn side of the knot is what we want to do last, as this is where the yarn pulls from when lifting your blanket, and we want to make sure it won't pull past the point where we will be cutting the ends. And once you feel like your knot is secure, you're going to grab one of the ends and start massaging the fibers away from the knot with one hand, like so. Place your index finger and thumb from your other hand on the end as close to the knot as you can, and then grab your scissors and cut as close to your fingers as possible. This method for cutting the yarn exposes the center thread through all the fibers. We need to seal that center thread to keep it from unraveling. Using fire is one way to do that, so let's grab our lighter. The trick to melting that center thread is to get the blue part of the flame directly on it. So just hold both the fiber end and the lighter straight up and get that blue flame on the center thread. Once the central thread produces a flame, remove the lighter from the thread and smush those fibers around it. Fray Check will also seal that center thread. I've been using this product for decades for a good reason. It works and it's durable. We'll prepare our second end the same way by massaging the fibers away from the knot with one hand And placing our index finger and thumb from the other hand as close to that knot as possible and cutting the yarn just above your fingers. Okay. Now find that center thread and grab the Fray Check. I used this on a fringe and 20 years later, not a single end had frayed. Really great product here. Now you just need a little bit, so just dab it on the center thread. Find it where it's at. Just dab it on there a little bit. You push the fibers up around the center thread and add one more dab of Fray Check if needed. So that is the tying method for joining. Each of these methods will produce a small hard covering, so to speak. But once it's worked up, it's rarely noticeable. It is noticeable, but it's rarely noticeable. Okay. So we can see the knot here, the two different colors joined together in the knot when you stretch it out. It's kind of like you can see it obviously, but it's okay. I'm just going to cut this knot out here. We have our two ends again, and we'll go over the burning method. We need to prepare them the exact same way we did for tying. Massage the yarn towards the end of the tail end using one hand and cut the yarn just above your fingers. On the other hand, holding the yarn to expose that center thread. Let's do the same for the second end. After you locate that center thread, massage the yarn towards the tail end in one hand. Cut the yarn just above your fingers to expose that center thread. I like to hold my ends like so, and I light the thread in the front. There needs to be a good strong flame on that center thread because we're not just sealing it. We need that second center thread to melt into the first. The surrounding fibers should not be on fire. If they are, you'll need to recut that end. Once we have a good strong flame, we're going to grab that second end and smoosh the center thread from the second end into the flame on the first end. Really press these ends together for about 3 seconds and begin forming the hard center ball between the yarn ends. Once that join has cooled, you'll want to give the yarn a few firm tugs. No harder than you would if you were to do so with the yarn itself, but hard enough to ensure the join is solid and stable. Okay? If the two ends come apart, start the process all over again. This takes practice. The advantage to using these two joining methods is that they're quick once mastered. You'll save a lot of time using either one of these methods. The disadvantage is that there's a good possibility one or more of these joins will come apart through wash and wear, causing your piece to unravel. So that's a pretty big disadvantage. You can also feel both the knot and the hard center from the burn, especially the burn, even once it's all worked up. Now, we'll return to the blanket to set up for joining using the third method, sewing. Here we are at the end of our first ball of yarn. And as you can see, you'll only need to leave roughly 3 inches unworked. Let's grab a new ball of yarn to unravel and get ready to work with that. If you'd rather use one of the first 2 methods for joining, this is where you'll do that. Either knot or burn your ends together to join and continue on knitting. if you'd prefer to try the third method, sewing, I'll be showing you how to do that momentarily. Now, as you continue knitting, your active row gets farther away from you. So to bring it closer, I found it most comfortable to roll the piece up from the bottom to just below the row you'll be working. However, just go with whatever feels comfortable to you. Okay, so let's grab that tail end of your yarn, locate the next active stitch from the row below, and just drop a loop through the back. Okay. So we want to adjust the stitch once we make it. Here we go, drawing that loop up through the back. And we want to pull that tail out about 2 to 3 inches, about the same length as the previous or the last stitch from the first ball of yarn. And then we want to make our 2-finger adjustment. Okay. Now what we're looking at here is the hole between these 2 stitches until we sew them together. I like to wait until the blanket is completely worked up before I do all the finishing work, which entails sewing those 2 ends together to join them. You can't pull it out without cutting the yarn at the join, which is the major reason why I wait until the end, because if you make a mistake, you'll definitely want to be able to pull that yarn out. Okay, so waiting till the end is most beneficial when you're using this sewing method as your joining method. So sometimes it is possible to remove the thread if you do sew it as you go. It's very difficult, unfortunately, to see really where that thread is, and that's the whole reason we have this sewing method the way we do. And it is possible to find that thread to go ahead and cut it where you need it. But once you do that and then you get to that second connection, you'll end up cutting the wrong thing. So you lose the use of some of that yarn, which we don't want to do. This stuff is pricey, so we don't want to waste any more than we need to. Okay. Now just keep on knitting until you've worked about 3/4 of your last ball of yarn. You'll want to stop knitting at the end of the odd row. Okay. Once you've reached that point, return to the tutorial so we can prep the last row of our blanket for the bind off chain, much like we did on row 1 after working the foundation chain. I'll see you soon. Welcome back. It's time to bind off our stitches and complete the finishing work. I've made a sample piece using 2 colors to make it easier for you when we cover the finishing work, which is sewing our ends together to join and close those holes from adding new yarn using the third joining method. Before we start binding off our blanket, I want to point out these holes. If one of those joins gets missed, the hole remains and your blanket will unravel eventually, so it's really important to make sure you get them all. Now let's get to the binding off of our blanket. We're going to be knitting the last even row, which is the prep row for binding off our stitches. Okay, so we'll work the last row like all the others with the exception of the size of the stitch. We want these stitches only 1 finger length across, as we did in the first row after making the foundation chain. So let's get started. You want to drop a loop through that back of the last stitch on the row and make it 1 finger in length. Okay, so we'll draw that loop up here, 1 finger length. We're going to do this all the way across and continue to cinch those stitches together to minimize that slack. Okay, and just continue knitting 1 finger length across to the end. Remember, we minimize that slack between our stitches to keep our blanket from overstretching. Now we're going to give each of those active stitches a tug to straighten them out. Okay, bring them up above the work. Now the bind off chain uses a lot of yarn because we need to make the chains large enough to cover the stitch and its slack. So we're going to use 3 to 4 fingers for the length. Okay. To make sure it's large enough, you want to lay it flat over the next stitch from the row below. And the chain you just made should touch the following active stitch, the one right beside the stitch that you're laying the chain on. Now draw a loop through that next active stitch from the row below and place your fingers through the back of the first chain. This is the back here. Okay, there's the front, there's your next stitch, and we're putting our finger through the back, and we're going to turn the loop towards the left and slip it over that chain. Okay, one stitch will be bound off once we complete that. So there we go. And you can see that it's flat. There's the only active stitch is the next one that we need to bind off. So now we want to adjust the loop size on that next chain to 3 to 4 fingers length. Place it over the next active stitch from the row below to make sure it's large enough. Okay, it should be touching the following active stitch. Then draw up a loop through the active stitch, place your fingers through the back of the chain, turn the loop towards the left and slip it over the next chain. Another stitch has been bound off. I want to show you real quick what it looks like when the chain is too small. Okay, so say we make this just 2 finger lengths in length. I'm just making some adjustments here to show you. Okay, when we lay the chain across, we can see that it doesn't even cover the next active stitch, let alone the one following it from the row below. Okay, and that's really important. However, when we knit that stitch, we can still draw it in close and slip that chain over the stitch to bind it off. Okay, when we do that, you can see a large gap between that bound off stitch and the active stitch from the row below. And there's that nice big gap. Okay, this is an extreme example of a very tight bind off, so it may not always be this apparent, but after making several chains too small, you'll see that the sides of your blanket start creeping inward, shortening the width at the very end. We want this bind off to be stretchy, not tight. Okay, as long as you follow the one rule that when laying the chain over the next active stitch from the row below, it should easily reach the following active stitch from the row below. Your bind off chain will never be too tight. Also, be sure to use your fingers as a gauge for those loops until you're able to make them consistently without using them. So we need to undo this last bind off stitch and adjust the length of our chain. Okay, place your fingers through the back of the loop. Turn it towards, well, we've got to knit that first, sorry. We're going to turn that, put our fingers through the back of that loop there, and turn it, and we're going to slip it over that stitch we just made. We're going to continue binding off our stitches this way, so adjust the chain, lay it over the next stitch to make sure it's long enough, and it is. We're going to knit that next stitch. Place our fingers through the back of the chain and slip it over the stitch we just made. Okay. Adjust the chain, lay it over, knit the next stitch, fingers through the back, turn towards the left, slip it over that last chain. Here you can see that bind off row. Let's test that stretch, and it's perfect. Okay, very good. Before I show you how to finish off that last stitch, I want to show you what your bind off chain will look like when the chains are too small, resulting in a tight finish. So I'm just going to undo all this work and work up a small finish real quick here. Okay. All right, here you can see those sides cinching inward. And when you look at the whole piece, you can see it doesn't line up with our foundation row width. And unfortunately, it will not stretch to that wider width. So to fix it, you have to rip it out and do it all over again. Please make sure you follow the finger rule and the length rule for having that chain reach the following stitch. Okay, we're back to where we left off before ripping it out, and you can see the width is now nice and even with the foundation chain. But we still have an active stitch to tend to, so how does that work? Well, we need to cut the yarn about 2 to 3 inches from the back of the stitch, and we're just going to pull that end completely through the chain. This becomes our second tail end. Now, regardless of which joining method you choose, you will always have a beginning and ending tail end to secure once you're finished knitting. Before I show you how to do that, I'm going to show you how to sew your joins together to close up those holes. Okay, you'll want to untie your first 2 ends, and what we need to do is create the slack between the 2 stitches where we began a new ball of yarn. Here's the slack joining the 2 previous stitches. Let's follow the path of that connection. It goes up and under the top of this last green stitch, and it also goes up and under this slack connection right above the one we're tracking to become the top of this first knit stitch I made with the new ball of yarn. It then leads down and under the slack connecting the last green stitch and the first yellow stitch, then back down and under the top of that last green stitch, which is the beginning of the new ball of yarn. Now let's look at it from the tail end of the green yarn. Here we have the yarn going up and under the top of this green knit stitch, then up and under this yellow slack, connecting the last green stitch and the first yellow stitch, then leads down and under the slack connecting the last green stitch and the first yellow stitch, then back underneath the top of that last green stitch, which is the beginning of the new yellow ball of yarn. Okay. Now we can see that slack there connecting the previous knit stitch. So we're going under the top of that knit stitch, and then it's also coming up and under that yellow slack. Here we have the top of the knit stitch going down both the slack and the top again of that previous knit stitch. Okay, and that is how all of your loops work. Okay, they form this interlocking loop. One thing that helped me differentiate between the slack and the top of a knit stitch is that when you have your blanket positioned with the back side facing up and the foundation chain at the bottom, like we have this piece positioned, the slack resembles a smile, whereas the top of a knitted stitch resembles an umbrella. It is the opposite when the right side of the blanket is facing up with the foundation chain at the bottom. The slack is the smile, and the top of a knit stitch is the umbrella. You may need to watch this over and over again to understand the interlocking connection between these stitches. This is important for seamlessly weaving in your ends and seamlessly joining 2 ends together for a well-polished blanket. Now that we've covered the anatomy of our knitted stitches, let's join our 2 ends. Either end can be used to create that slack connection between the last stitch of the old yarn and the first stitch of the new yarn. I'll begin by showing you how to make that connection with the yellow tail, or the tail to the right. Okay? We need to connect this yellow tail end to the green tail end by following the path of that green tail end. So let's start by placing the yellow tail across towards the left and pulling it up under the knit stitch or the green umbrella. You can now see that the connection has been made. We've created the slack or smile required to connect these two stitches. And I'm just adjusting here the slack to make sure it's the same size as the previous one. Now we need to secure both ends by sewing them together, and we're going to do that in two places. Once below the green knit stitch, like so, okay, or the umbrella, it's at the top of the stitch, and then again just above the umbrella, okay? So those are the two places we want to make the connection. So let's grab our thread and we'll cut a good length because we'll be doubling that up. Once the thread is cut, double it up evenly and grab it at the ends or at the end that's folded over. Okay, I'll demonstrate that here. We're cutting the yarn or the thread, sorry, doubling it over, drawing it up evenly so that both those ends meet up. And then we're going to grab it at the end that's folded over. Okay. Now we're going to place the thread under the new slack connection or smile and under the green tail end. Draw the thread up evenly and tie a knot just under the green umbrella. Notice that it's right between the green umbrella and that yellow smile. Now you want to lift the blanket off your surface as a weight to keep that first crossover in place. Now tie another knot. Give your thread a good tug to make sure it's tightly secured around the two ends, just between the green umbrella and yellow smile. Lay each thread on adjacent sides of the knot. Take the thread on your left, pull it under the green umbrella, and lay it to the left. Now take the thread on your right, wrap it around the green thread, pull it under the yellow smile, and lay it to the right. Now we want to secure the yellow tail to the green tail just above the green umbrella. So tie a knot just above that umbrella, lifting the blanket up off your surface, and tie another knot. Give your thread a good tug. There we go. And now we need to test the join. Tugging on the two end tails is not a good way to test the join. We test it two ways. First, by pulling the yellow smile and the green umbrella firmly apart. It should not slide apart or separate in any way. Then we want to grab the green yarn just above the yellow smile, along with the tail, the green yarn running down through the yellow smile. Give those two a good tug. And again, this should not slide apart in any way. If your test is unsuccessful, feed the yarn back under the umbrella and smile on either side and tie your knots in the same place the first knots were made, and then again where the second knots were made. If you have a successful test, your join is stable and we tie off the threads. Start with the unconnected threads and tie them together once. Then we're going to cut the connected end and tie them together once, giving a good tug to make sure it's tight. Now I grab one thread in my right hand and I tie it alone to each remaining thread and one last time to the third thread. So there's 1, 2, 3, one last time to the first thread, and 4, and that was the first one we started with. Grab up all 4 threads and cut roughly 1 to 2 centimeters above your knot. Now we can cut those ends and either burn the center threads or use Fray Check on the center threads to seal them, as demonstrated with the tying join method. And once that's completed, your join will be seamless. This method takes quite a bit more time, which is its only disadvantage. And the method you choose is based on your own personal level of desired quality and the risk you're willing to take on the stability of the joins. Okay? Okay, I'm going to show you one last time how to cut your ends. So you're basically going to find that join, put your fingers as close to the join as possible, and cut as close to your fingers as possible to expose that center thread. Here you can see it. If you can't see it, you'll want to feel around for it. It's a little bit of a hard, little bit of a poke. And then just kind of press down those fibers around it to make it stick up a little bit more. And we either use the lighter or Fray Check, and we'll start off with the Fray Check. I've had this bottle for a while. A little dab does you good. You don't need much of this Fray Check. So what we're going to do, again, we want that center thread, and we're just going to put a little dab of the Fray Check right on that thread. It shouldn't be extended out to the fibers. It is a little tiny little bit, but that's okay. And we just kind of want to squish it and kind of push it down a little bit further on that center thread. Okay, I'm just doing a little bit of trimming here. And then I want to feel around, and I think I want to put just a little bit more of the Fray Check there. So we find that center thread and just dab it a little. You don't even need to squeeze that bottle, okay? Just let it come out naturally. And now we just kind of squish it in there, and you can see it just disappears into the fiber. Now we'll do the burning method for sealing this tail end. We find that connection, put our fingers as close to it as possible, and grab our scissors, and we're going to cut just right above our fingers, as close to our fingers as possible after smushing those fibers towards the tail end. Gives us a nice clean cut, exposing that center thread. Again, if you can't see it, feel for it. And now we'll grab our lighter. The trick to the burning is that you want to hold both the yarn and the lighter straight up, and you want to join the flame on the blue part of the flame with that center thread, melting it. Okay, doesn't necessarily have to start on fire. If it starts on fire, then just put it out real quick, like I'm going to do here, and then smush those fibers in towards that melted thread to kind of smush them together. You might have some fibers come out. That's okay, just pull them off. Fluff it up. And then we're just going to smush it back into the blanket there. And as you can see, we've got a completely seamless join and no hole. Pretty cool. Our final lesson is on how to seamlessly weave in and secure our two tail ends, which will give you good practice after just learning the anatomy of your stitches. We'll begin by working with the first tail end from the foundation chain. If you started your chain as demonstrated in the tutorial, that is without a knot, then we can weave in this end seamlessly. We pull that tail out like I demonstrated, and what we want to do is find the stitch we knitted through the hump of this last chain on row 1 and thread the yarn through it towards the back of your blanket. So there is that loop. We just pull it through, adjust the length of the chain until you're satisfied with how it looks. And that first chain on the foundation now looks like a continuation from the edge stitches. Now let's turn the blanket over so the back is facing up. Now the smile closest to the tail end is the path we want to follow for weaving in this end. So we'll lay that tail across this smile to the left, thread it up and under the connecting smile, then up and under that first smile. Right above. The tail has now been seamlessly woven into the back of your work, and we're going to secure it exactly the same way we did using the sewing method for joining, right in those 2 places. We want to secure the end directly below that smile, then again between that smile and the connecting umbrella to the left. So let's grab our thread. Cut a good length, double it up evenly, and grab it at the end that's folded over, just like we did before. Then pull the thread under both strands of yarn, just under that smile. Before we do that, I want to show you what you're connecting here. You can see you're connecting the tail end and then that other piece that's already part of the stitch. Okay, so those two have to be tied together, and that's where you're going to put your thread under. And draw the thread up evenly, and you're going to tie a knot just under that smile. Okay. Lift the blanket off your surface as a weight to keep that crossover in place, and tie another knot. Give your thread a nice good tug to make sure it's tightly secured around the 2 strands. Okay. Lay each thread on adjacent sides of the knot. Take the thread on your left, pull it under the umbrella, and lay it to the left. Now take the thread on the right, push it under that smile, and lay it to the right. Now we want to secure the tail between the smile and the umbrella, so tie a knot between the 2, lifting the blanket up off your surface and tying another knot. We're aiming for the knot to be right between that umbrella and smile. And give it a good tug. Now we're going to tie the unconnected end of the thread once. Then cut the connected end and tie them together once, giving a good tug to make sure it's tight. Now just grab one of those threads and tie it to each remaining thread one at a time, finishing with the first thread you knotted. Again, this ensures a very secure hold on that tail end. When finished, I'm going to grab up all 4 of those threads and cut roughly 1 to 2 centimeters above the knot, and the thread disappears into those fibers. There we go. As you can see, it's coming out through the very last knit we made in the bind off chain. Now we can cut that end and either burn the center thread or use a Fray Check on the center thread to seal it as demonstrated with the tying join method. So we're going to brush those ends towards the tail end and cut, exposing our center thread. Again, right there. I'm going to grab the lighter. There we go. Smush it up. And we've got a nice seamless connection there. Okay, now on to our final finishing touch, the bind off tail end. We're going to turn this to the side or edge of the blanket and find the path of that tail end, okay? As you can see, it's coming out through the very last knit stitch we made in the bind off chain. So we want to pull the tail back through where it came from towards the back of the blanket. It's right through that stitch there. Now adjust the chain so that each leg is equal in length on either side, and you're going to turn it to the side and see how it's now seamlessly connected to that edge stitch. Now let's turn the blanket over so the back side is faced up, and the bind of row is now closest to the bind off row is now closest to you with the tail to your left. This is a little bit different because we need to first position the tail so we can weave it in where the path is not leading directly to the bind off chain. So we're going to pull the tail up and under this smile here to follow the path of this umbrella here. So lay the tail across this umbrella and thread it down and under the connecting smile, then down and under the umbrella directly beneath it. I guess directly under that first umbrella that we laid it over. Okay, so you're going to push that in and through that umbrella just underneath, then bring it over to the right. You can see we've got those interlocking stitches going this way. Okay. The tail is now seamlessly woven into the back of your work, and you know what to do from here. So let's secure that tail by sewing it down. Identify your two strands that you're going to be tying together, and let's grab our thread. Okay, cut a good length of thread. We're going to double it up evenly, just like we did before, and grab it at the end that's folded over. Okay, so we're going to pull that thread under both of those strands, the tail and the smile. Draw the thread up evenly and tie a knot just under that umbrella. Sorry, that was the umbrella, not the smile. Okay. Lift the blanket off your surface as a weight to keep that first crossover in place. With the blanket still suspended, tie another knot and give your thread a nice good tug. Lay each thread on either side of the knot. Take the thread on your left and pull it up under the smile and lay it to the left. Now take the thread on your right, wrap it around the tail, pull it up and under the smile, and lay it to your right. Now we want to secure the tail between the smile and the umbrella, so tie a knot between the two. You're going to lift the blanket up off your surface and tie another knot. Give your thread a nice good tug. Now tie the unconnected threads together once. Then cut the connected end and tie those together once, giving it a nice good tug to make sure it's tight. Now grab one thread and tie it to each remaining thread one at a time, finishing with the first thread that you knotted. Here's 3, and there's 4. Grab up all 4 ends, cut roughly 1 to 2 centimeters above that knot on the thread, and the thread nicely disappears into those fibers. There it is. Can't even see it. Now we can cut those ends and either burn the center threads or use Fray Check on the center threads to seal them as demonstrated with the tying join method. Once all the joins and tails have been secured, you're going to lay out your blanket and make any minor aesthetic adjustments. Just stretching a little bit, kind of making sure everything's even. Okay. Then we're going to fold the bind off chain over to meet up with the foundation chain to compare your chains, and they should be similar in size and width. And that is all there is to it. That's kind of funny because there's quite a bit to it. But anyway, I really hope you enjoyed the video instruction. I hope you found it very informational and helpful. I can tell you that this is probably the only tutorial out there that will give you as much information as this tutorial has given you here today. So, thank you once again for your business and happy knitting.